Greetings and welcome to the Old Ways Rising Farm Nerd Nook for the first in a series of videos I'm going to call Permaculture Chalk Talks. So I'm going to take just a very short moment here and talk about this series a little bit. We're going to discuss some deeper principles that are really important if you want to dive in and make good progress toward designing and planning and building your garden out to that next level. Beyond just, this is all beyond just, basic tips and hacks to get something growing. This is the next level when you're ready to dig into the deep information and really want to understand it. So what I'm going to do for each of these videos, these will be not YouTube shorts, but also not a 45-minute lecture, somewhere in between. They'll be a little bit variable in length. Each is going to have three parts, right? First is going to be some definitions. We are going to have scientific content in these, and that means that we are going to need to define some things. So that'll be part one of each. It's going to be definitions, 1, 2, maybe 3 definitions sometimes. Okay. Then we're going to do the meat of the material and the chalk talk, right? And really dive into those definitions and explain why they're important and how they relate to your garden. And then the third is going to be some real applications. Some of these will have very direct, immediate real applications. Some of these might be a set in a chain of a couple of short videos, and at the end of that, you'll get into the real applications. But we'll talk at the end of each of these a little bit about how it directly relates to your landscape. Okay? So let's get into it. The first of these that I want to do is plant nutrients. Talking about plant nutrients. This is something that everybody wants to ask. You go to a garden center, every new gardener is going to go to a garden center, buy a plant, and then ask, what fertilizer do I need? Right? It's a standard question. Now, spoiler, a lot of the time the answer to that is just water it and see how it responds to your soil as it is before you make more decisions. But we'll talk about that sort of strategy later on in some other videos. But here I want to talk about what are plant nutrients, what are they doing in a plant, and why do you need them, how do you think about them? So the first definition is just this, plant nutrients in and of itself. And the nutrients that we put on our plants are elements that a plant uses to make stuff. Okay? An element that a plant uses to make stuff. Stuff have 1 F or 2? 2, good. Okay. I'm a terrible speller. You'll figure that out pretty quickly. So I'll be asking questions of my wife here from time to time. Okay. An element that a plant uses to make stuff. That's a nutrient. And that's the first definition. Now, second definition is kind of more of a principle than a definition of a word. And the principle is something called Liebig's Law of the Minimum. This relates to how we think about definitions. Spelling on this right, E-I-B. Okay, Liebig's Law of the Minimum. This is a principle, originally comes out of chemistry and organic synthesis, but it relates to many, many, many things. And if you go and take a bunch of college ecology classes, you'll see this idea crop up all over the place. Okay? So Liebig's Law of the Minimum is that when you're making something and you have multiple ingredients in that something, one ingredient runs out first. Okay? One ingredient runs out first. In chemistry, we call that the limiting reagent. But it can be called anything you want. It's just the thing that runs out first. When that thing runs out, that thing runs out, the process stops. Okay? One ingredient runs out first, and when that runs out, the process stops. There's a bunch of analogies of this. The one that I like to use is the cheese sandwich analogy. Okay, so you're making cheese sandwiches. You need 2 pieces of bread and 1 piece of cheese at a minimum. Right? Bread, cheese, bread, sandwich. Now, I personally think that's kind of a lame sandwich. You need more than 1 piece of cheese. But you can make a sandwich with 1 piece of cheese. So, if you have 10 pieces of cheese and 20 pieces of bread, you can make 10 sandwiches. If you have 10 pieces of cheese and 5 pieces of bread, you can only make 4 sandwiches. Right? Because you run out of bread before you run out of cheese. If that's the case, and you want to make more sandwiches, you don't go out and buy more cheese, because you haven't solved the problem, because the bread is still what ran out first. You would need to go buy more bread. Right? That's Liebig's law of the minimum. Okay, we're going to come back to that. Those are our 2 definitions. Let's dig into this concept of nutrients. And again, nutrients, elements that a plant uses to make stuff. Our bodies are made out of stuff. A plant's body is made out of stuff, right? When we consume food that's already in a complex form, right? We eat protein. A plant doesn't eat protein. A plant takes up mineral nutrients, elements, in a fairly simple form, an elemental form or a simple form, and then builds everything from scratch. Okay? So what are they building? Well, they're building carbohydrates. Just like us, plants need their carbs. But they make them from the process of photosynthesis, and then we eat them after a plant made them. What's in a carbohydrate? Well, we've got carbon, we've got oxygen, we've got hydrogen. We've always got hydrogen. Hydrogen is the little stuff that just takes up all the empty space on your molecules. We're not too worried about it. It's just kind of hanging along for the ride here most of the time. So carbs, we have carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. What else do we have? Well, we have fats and waxes, right? Olive oil is oil from a plant, right? So we have our fats. Okay? What's in fats? Mostly carbon and hydrogen, but if it's triglyceride, we've got our fatty acid, we've got some other things going on, most of which is oxygen. Yes, phospholipids have a little bit extra, but we're not going to dive that deep into this right now. Okay? Then we have our proteins. What's in your proteins? Well, again, most of it, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. But then proteins also have nitrogen in every amino acid. And some of them have sulfur. Okay, some amino acids have sulfur in them. We have a slightly longer list, but you can see it's still mostly carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, with a little bit of other stuff going on. And then our nucleic acids, DNA, RNA, nucleotides, ATPs, all of that stuff. I'm just going to use DNA as the most well-known abbreviation here, but I'm using this as a shorthand for a large class of molecules. Again, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Okay? Now this gets an extra too, because the backbone of your DNA is phosphate. So we need to add a P in here. Okay? These are the most abundant macronutrients that are used to make the physical structure of the plant. Okay? But we have other things going on. We have micronutrients. Okay? And these are going to be responsible for water balance and for cell-to-cell signaling and some other important plant processes Okay? And our critically important micronutrients here are chlorine, potassium. Okay? Now, potassium later we're going to call it a macronutrient for fertilizer purposes, but it's not present at the same abundance as carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay? Different fields will classify and lump and split these things slightly differently. These are the most important micronutrients. Some still, again, different people will lump and split. Got magnesium in there too. Different people will lump and split in slightly different ways with these things. Okay? And these are water balance. Some very, very common enzymes will use magnesium, and cell-to-cell signaling. Calcium is very important. Okay? So these are micronutrients that almost rise to the level of macronutrient, and some are regularly called macronutrients. Okay? It's kind of a middle tier. The bottom tier then is trace. Okay? Your trace nutrients, boron, zinc, copper, iron, molybdenum. I'm sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, those are the most important of these. And then cobalt and selenium get some arguments. Okay? So that's the bottom tier. These are important for helping enzymes do their job. They're not structural. They're not dominant cell-to-cell signaling. They're not dominant in maintaining water balance. But they get tacked in once in a while into this enzyme or that enzyme to help it do something that it can't do just with this main list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? So these 6 are the most macro. These are the most trace. And then we kind of have a middle tier that different people will lump and split under different terms, depending on context. Okay? Now, where do these come from? Well, carbon and oxygen come from CO2 in the photosynthesis process. Okay? So, carbon dioxide. Earth is not lacking for carbon dioxide. Right? This is abundant. It's in the air. It's everywhere. You don't need to import CO2 to make your garden grow. Okay? Oxygen and hydrogen come from water, also through the process of photosynthesis. Okay? This may or may not be limiting depending on where you live and what the weather is doing in a certain year. Okay? Nitrogen comes from N2 gas in the atmosphere. We're going to do an entire talk on this. This is the one which nitrogen and carbon are the ones which have a gas phase being dominant in their cycle. So they're going to be talked about distinct from the rest of these. Okay? The rest come from minerals in the ground. Okay? Now, sulfur, I'm going to put sulfur here with a little gas phase asterisk because it does have some gas phase influences, but at the scale of your garden, the sulfur your plants are interacting with is probably coming from a mineral source more than from the air. Okay? There are exceptions to that. I am radically oversimplifying in that statement, but the mineral form is the form that is most important for most people's gardens most of the time. So that's how we're going to discuss it in this series as a mineral sourced element. Okay. So that's the nutrients, kind of top tier, middle tier, bottom tier, whatever you want to call it. Now, these flow into and out of a system through complex, what we call biogeochemical processes. That will be the first definition for the second in this series. We're not going to go into that right now. Just wanted to introduce the idea of these things, what they're doing, where they're occurring in your plant, and very briefly kind of do you want to think of them as a gas phase or as a, I should circle water too, because it's definitely, plants are interacting with liquid water, but liquid water comes from water vapor, right? Gas phase, and the rest of all of this are minerals coming primarily from solid phase. So how does this apply to your garden? Well, the big application point is understanding this Liebig's law of the minimum. So this, when we're applying, is you want to apply all of these things in the proper balance. Okay? All of these are raw ingredients to make stuff, and Liebig's law of the minimum tells us something important about making stuff. Okay? When you buy a bag of fertilizer, you're going to have the NPK numbers. Okay? Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You see where they are on our list. And this is why I say on a fertilizer bag, potassium is being called a macronutrient, even though it's in the middle tier in terms of overall abundance. Okay? These are the three macronutrients as defined by fertilizer manufacturers, because these are the three that are most commonly most lacking in most soils most often. Notice a whole chain of key words in that sentence, right? So these are your fertilizer macronutrients. Okay, this is biochemistry, this is marketing. And then when you buy a bag of fertilizer, you'll see some set of numbers, right? 10, 10, 20 is a common one. Triple 10 is a common one. 10, 20, 10 is a common one. 40, 10, 10, right? You get some set of numbers there, okay? What these NPK numbers are is the percentage of each of those three elements that is immediately available to the plants the day you put the fertilizer down or the week you put the fertilizer down. Okay? And when you're picking one of these, you want it to be in balance with the soil you already have, the plant you're trying to grow, and the rest of the availability of this whole rest of the list. Okay? So if you look at nitrogen, nitrogen pushes top growth. It pushes green growth. Okay? Very commonly you will see stuff with this sort of ratio or something close to it being marketed, 20, 30, 40% nitrogen, being marketed as a general purpose fertilizer. Okay? Fertilizer companies love to do that, especially the mass market ones that you're going to find in big box stores, because it forces top growth. So within a week or two of putting this kind of fertilizer on a plant, you're going to see a huge explosion of green stuff, right? The problem is, in most cases, this is forgetting Liebig's law of the minimum and is out of balance with the rest of this. So because you're pushing the top growth, you're siphoning all of this stuff into the leaves away from the rest of the plant. And when you run out of any one of these, the process stops. The process we're discussing is growing. So if you push all of this stuff into the leaves, you're then starving the roots. So if the process is forced to continue in the leaves, it's forced to diminish in the roots, the flowers, the fruit. Okay? So if you're growing lettuce, sure, I don't care. You're trying to grow leaves and it's an annual, so you're not too worried about that. If you're trying to grow tomatoes and you put this down, you're almost always going to get blossom end rot because you force the, calcium into the leaves away from the fruit. And starving the fruit of calcium causes blossom end rot. Okay? So putting the high nitrogen, forcing the top growth, Liebig's law of the minimum is still a law. You run out of calcium, the process of growing fruit stops and it just aborts the end of the fruit. And that's where you get blossom end rot in your tomatoes, peppers, squash, things like that. Phosphate pushes growth in non-green portions of the plant, particularly flowers and fruit. So if you want tomatoes, you would want something much more like this second one. You do need some nitrogen, you do need some potassium, but you really want to push the fruit. So something that's high in phosphate and in balance with what the plant is doing and what the rest of the availability of nutrients are in your soil will get you better fruit production than one of these big box mass market fertilizers, which just gives you a giant plant, nothing else. Okay, giant looking plant, I should say. But this will particularly promote flowering and fruit and keep the other terms in balance with the rest of your nutrient availability. Something high in potassium like this first one, potassium again pushes non-green growth in your plant. It's particularly good for stimulating root growth. Okay, root and stem, the woody portions. So if you're growing a root crop, a potato, a turnip, a radish, something high in the K is going to be good. Okay, wood ashes are particularly high in potassium, which is why a lot of people say to put wood ashes on root crops. This is why. It's high in this term. It has a 0 for nitrogen because the nitrogen burned off because it's gas phase and fire burns gases away. Okay? So something high in your potassium is good for your root crops. So again, what is the plant demanding of the soil? What does the soil have available determines what balance of nutrients you want from your fertilizer. Okay. And then the last take home is make sure when you get a fertilizer, whether you're buying a salt-based fertilizer from a big box store or you're using the natural, certified organic, or permaculture friendly fertilizers, you want to do some research on that fertilizer and figure out where it is with the balance of your middle tier macronutrients and your trace nutrients, right? Because you want all of these things. But again, balance is the key word. Anything out of balance stops everything. Liebig's law of the minimum. And that is the biggest take home from this whiteboard. Okay? These need to be present, but all of these are toxic at some level. And that level is fairly low. If any of these come up to the same concentrations as these, you're going to kill your plants. Okay? Look around people's pools. If people dye their water blue in a pool with copper to keep the algal growth down, somewhere that pool system is dripping, and underneath that drip, there's no grass growing. Guarantee it. Because copper has burned out. North of Allentown, Pennsylvania, there's a zinc mining region. Goes into the northern Jersey as well. There are entire mountainsides which have been denuded by zinc vapors from zinc refining. Right? So it's a trace nutrient, but if it goes above trace, everything dies. Okay? So these have to be in low quantity, but they still have to be there. Okay? They can't just be nothing. So balance. Liebig's law of the minimum dictates balance. If there's one key take home, that's it. So that'll wrap up this edition. The next edition, we're going to talk about those biogeochemical cycles I alluded to and how these nutrients come into, move through, and out of a system. Again, whether that be a large landscape or just your vegetable garden. So I will see you then.